Picture this. 3,000 knights, exhausted, outnumbered 20 to 1, standing on a muddy field as 60,000 enemy warriors surge toward them like a human tsunami. The morning mist clings to their armor as they grip their weapons, knowing that in the next few hours they will either achieve the impossible or die trying. This is the story of Agincourt, October 25th, 1415, the day when the impossible became legend. Welcome back to Epic Histories, where we dive deep into the most extraordinary moments that shaped our world. I'm your host, and today we're traveling back over 6 centuries to witness what many consider the greatest military upset in human history. A battle so unlikely, so dramatic that it would inspire poets, playwrights, and storytellers for generations to come. The year is 1415. Europe is convulsing with war, plague, and political upheaval. On one side stands Henry V of England, young, ambitious, and desperately seeking to legitimize his reign through conquest. On the other, the flower of French nobility, confident in their overwhelming numbers and military superiority. Between them lies a rain-soaked field near the village of Agincourt, about to become the stage for one of history's most stunning reversals of fortune. But this isn't just a story about medieval warfare. It's about human courage in the face of impossible odds, the power of innovative tactics against traditional thinking, and how a single day can echo through centuries, shaping national identities and changing the course of history forever. To understand the magnitude of what happened at Agincourt, we must first journey back to the tangled web of medieval politics that led to this moment. The year 1415 found England and France locked in what we now call the 100 Years' War, though it would actually stretch for 16 years, making it one of the longest conflicts in European history. Henry V had ascended to the English throne in 1413, inheriting not just a crown but a legacy of territorial disputes dating back to the English kings claimed vast territories in France through inheritance and conquest, but by 1415, these holdings had dwindled to little more than the port city of Calais. For a young king seeking to establish his legitimacy and unite his fractious nobles behind a common cause, the glittering prize of French territories proved irresistible. The French, meanwhile, were caught in their own political turmoil. King Charles II suffered from bouts of madness that left the realm effectively rudderless, while two powerful factions, the Burgundians and the Armagnacs, tore the kingdom apart with their feuding. This internal strife would prove to be France's greatest weakness, as we'll soon see. In the summer of 1415, Henry V launched his invasion of France with approximately 12,000 men, a formidable force by medieval standards, but tiny compared to what France could theoretically muster. His first target was the heavily fortified port city of Harfleur, which controlled access to the Seine River and the approaches to Paris. The siege of Harfleur began on August 17. What Henry hoped would be a quick victory turned into a grinding 5-week nightmare. The French defenders, led by the experienced Raoul de Gaucourt, fought with desperate tenacity. They had flooded the surrounding marshlands, making assault nearly impossible, and their walls bristled with cannons, still a relatively new technology that would prove devastatingly effective. Day after day, Henry's army battered the walls with their own artillery and massive trebuchets, hurling stones weighing hundreds of pounds. The English dug elaborate siege works approaching the walls through covered trenches, while French crossbow bolts and early firearms claimed lives with each advance. The air filled with the acrid smoke of gunpowder and the screams of wounded men, but the true enemy proved to be disease. Medieval armies were breeding grounds for illness, and the marshy terrain around Harfleur created perfect conditions for dysentery, typhus, and other killers. Henry watched helplessly as his army melted away, not from French steel but from invisible enemies that respected neither rank nor valor. By the time Harfleur finally surrendered on September 22, the English army had been reduced by disease and casualties to roughly 9,000 men. Among the fallen was the Earl of Suffolk, one of Henry's most trusted commanders. The king himself fell ill but recovered, though many of his nobles did not. The flower of English military leadership was withering before the campaign had truly begun. Any rational commander would have withdrawn to England, consolidated his gains, and planned for the next year's campaign. But Henry V was not a rational commander. He was a king with everything to prove. Despite his advisors' pleas to return to England, Henry made a decision that would either cement his legend or destroy his army entirely. He announced that they would march to Calais, some 160 miles north, in what he claimed would be a simple parade through his rightful territories. In reality, it was one of the most audacious, some would say foolhardy military decisions in history. The march began on October 8, 1415, with roughly 6,000 men, 1,000 men at arms and 5,000 archers. They were low on supplies, exhausted from the siege, and many were still recovering from illness. The French, meanwhile, had finally begun to mobilize their massive military machine. Messengers raced across France, summoning the greatest nobles of the realm to defend their homeland against the English upstart. For the first week, the march proceeded without major incident. The English crossed the Somme River at the ford of Blanchetaque, the same crossing point Edward III had used before his great victory at Crécy in 13. But as they pushed deeper into French territory, it became clear that they were walking into a trap. French scouts shadowed their every move, and reports reached Henry that a massive army was assembling to block their path to Calais. The Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, commanded forces that grew larger each day as nobles arrived with their The Count of Eu brought 800 men-at-arms, the Duke of Alençon, another 600, and still they came, a glittering host of French chivalry determined to wipe out the English invaders. By October 20th, as the English approached the village of Agincourt, French heralds arrived under flags of truce. Their message was simple: surrender now, and Henry and his nobles would be ransomed according to the laws of chivalry. The common soldiers would be executed, but the leadership would live. Henry's response has echoed through history. We are the king's men and we will fight to the death before we surrender. The night of October 24th, 1415, was one of the longest in English military history. As darkness fell over the countryside near Agincourt, two armies settled into their positions for what everyone knew would be a decisive battle at dawn. The contrast between the two forces could not have been more stark. On the French side, the largest army assembled in decades spread across the landscape like a glittering constellation. Conservative estimates put their numbers at 60,000 men, though some French chronicles claim as many as. The cream of French nobility was there, 3 dukes, 7 counts, and over 1,500 knights, each representing generations of martial tradition and military excellence. Their pavilions covered the countryside, and the light of thousands of campfires reflected off polished armor and weapons. The French were supremely confident. Why shouldn't they be? They outnumbered the English by 20 to 1. Their knights were the finest heavy cavalry in Europe, and they were fighting on their own soil for their own king. Many had brought extra horses and changes of armor, expecting the battle to be little more than a grand tournament, followed by a profitable day of ransoming English prisoners. In the French camp, nobles debated not whether they would win, but how to divide the spoil. Who would have the honor of capturing King Henry himself? How should the ransoms be split? Some argued that the battle would be over so quickly that many wouldn't even have time to win glory. The Duke of Orleans supposedly complained that there weren't enough Englishmen to provide honor for all the French knights present. Meanwhile, in the English camp, the mood was starkly different. Henry had perhaps 3,000 men left, 900 men at arms, and they were exhausted, sick, and many were suffering from dysentery so severe they had cut holes in their clothing for convenience. They had been marching for over 2 weeks on minimal rations, sleeping in the rain and watching their numbers dwindle each day. But if the English were afraid, they didn't show it. Henry V proved his leadership that night, moving through the camp in the pre-dawn darkness, speaking quietly with his men. According to contemporary accounts, he told them they were fighting not just for England but for the honor of every man present. He promised that any who wished could leave without shame, but those who stayed would be brothers forever. A band of brothers who would be remembered as long as men drew breath. The king also made a practical decision that would prove crucial. Recognizing that traditional medieval tactics would spell doom against such overwhelming numbers, he chose a defensive position between two woods that would prevent the French from using their numerical superiority effectively. The battlefield was only about 1,000 yards wide, creating a natural bottleneck that would force the French to attack on a narrow front. Dawn broke gray and misty on October 25, 1415, the feast day of Saints Crispin and Crispinian. patron saints of shoemaking. The rain that had fallen intermittently for days had turned the plowed field between the two armies into a quagmire of thick, clinging mud. What had been planned as an open battlefield now resembled a vast bog, treacherous underfoot, and difficult for heavily armored men to navigate. The English deployed in their traditional formation, men-at-arms in the center, with wedges of archers on the flanks and integrated throughout the line. Each archer carried a 6-foot yew longbow and a sheaf of 24 arrows, bodkin points designed to penetrate armor at close range, broadheads for maximum damage at distance. They also carried stakes, 6-foot wooden spears, sharpened to points and designed to be driven into the ground as protection against cavalry charges. Henry positioned himself in the center of the men-at-arms, his royal banner clearly visible. He wore a jeweled crown over his bassinet helmet, a target that made him easily recognizable but also a symbol of defiant royal authority. Around him stood the surviving English nobility, his brothers the Duke of Gloucester and the Duke of Bedford, the Earl of Oxford, Sir Thomas Erpingham commanding the archers, and other veterans of the siege of Harfleur. The French deployment was more complex and, as events would prove, more problematic. The Constable d'Albret commanded 3 massive divisions, the vanguard under the Duke of Orleans, and the Constable himself a main battle under the Duke of Alençon, and a rear guard under the Count of Marle and the Count of Foch. Each division contained thousands of men, with the vanguard alone numbering perhaps 8,000 knights and men-at-arms. But the French formation contained fatal flaws that would only become apparent once battle was joined. The narrowness of the field meant that their massive numbers became a liability rather than an asset. Knights were packed so tightly they could barely move, let alone fight effectively. Worse, the traditional French tactic of massed cavalry charges was nearly impossible in the mud, which had been churned into a thick paste by thousands of hooves and feet. For nearly 4 hours the two armies faced each other across the muddy field. Medieval warfare often involved these extended standoffs, as neither side wanted to give up the advantage of defense. The French, confident in their numbers, were content to wait. They assumed the English would eventually be forced to attack, and when they did, they would be slaughtered. But Henry V understood that time was not on his side. His men were hungry, sick, and growing weaker by the hour. The French were receiving reinforcements even as they waited. If this was to be decided, it must be decided now. At approximately 11 a.m., Henry V made the decision that would determine the fate of his army and his kingdom. He ordered the advance. The English line, thin but disciplined, began moving across the muddy field toward the French positions. It was a march into what seemed certain death. But every man stepped forward. The archers moved with their stakes, driving them into the ground at an angle to create a forest of sharp points facing the enemy. The men-at-arms, heavily armored but vastly outnumbered, closed ranks and prepared for the shock of contact. Henry himself was at the front, his jeweled crown glittering even in the gray morning light. As the English approached to within longbow range, approximately 300 yards, Henry raised his sword and gave the command that would echo through history: draw. The sound of 2,100 bowstrings being drawn simultaneously was said to be like thunder. Then came the second command: loose. The sky darkened as thousands of arrows arced toward the French lines. The bodkin points, designed to penetrate armor, struck with devastating effect. Horses screamed and fell, throwing their riders into the mud. Knights who had never faced the English longbow in such concentrations were stunned by the intensity of the barrage. But the French were not to be deterred by arrow fire alone. The vanguard, led by d'Albret himself, began their charge. Thousands of the finest heavy cavalry in Europe spurred their horses forward, lances lowered, banners streaming. The ground shook with the thunder of hooves, and it seemed that nothing could stop such a massive assault. It was then that the mud betrayed the French. Horses that should have been galloping were reduced to a labored trot, then a walk. Then many simply became mired in the churned earth. Knights fell from exhausted mounts and struggled to rise in their heavy armor, only to be struck down by English arrows or pulled down by English men-at-arms who had learned to fight smart rather than chivalrously. What followed was unlike any battle in medieval memory. The traditional rules of chivalrous warfare, where nobles were captured for ransom rather than killed, were abandoned in the desperate struggle for survival. The English, fighting for their lives against impossible odds, showed no mercy. The French, packed so tightly they could barely swing their weapons, found their numerical advantage turned into a deadly liability. The Duke of Alençon led his division in a desperate attempt to break the English center. For a moment, it seemed he might succeed. French knights actually reached Henry's position and struck at the king himself. Henry's helmet was damaged, and the fleur-de-lis from his crown was reportedly struck off by a French axe. His younger brother, the Duke of Gloucester, was wounded and fell at Henry's feet. But the English line held. The archers, having exhausted their arrows, drew swords and mallets and joined the melee. These were not noble-born knights, but professional soldiers, many of them veterans of campaigns in Wales and Scotland. They fought with a pragmatic brutality that shocked the French nobility. Daggers found the joints in armor, warhammers crushed helmets, and the mud became thick with blood. The Constable d'Albret fell early in the fighting, struck down as he tried to rally his men. The Duke of Brabant arrived on the battlefield with reinforcements, but seeing the carnage, he rashly charged forward with only his immediate retinue and was quickly overwhelmed and killed. One by one, the great names of French chivalry fell in the mud of Agincourt. Perhaps the most tragic figure was the Duke of Orleans, the nephew of the French king. Wounded and surrounded, he was captured alive, one of the few French nobles to be taken prisoner rather than killed. He would spend the next 25 years in English captivity, writing poetry and watching his homeland from afar. The battle reached its climax when Henry received reports that a French force was attacking his baggage train in the rear. Whether this was true or merely a panic-induced rumor is unclear, but Henry's response was swift and ruthless. He ordered the execution of all French prisoners except those of the highest rank, a decision that violated every convention of medieval warfare but demonstrated his determination to survive at any cost. English soldiers moved through the battlefield with daggers, killing wounded Frenchmen who might have expected to be ransomed. The muddy field became a charnel house, littered with the bodies of French nobility. It was said that you could walk from one end of the battlefield to the other stepping only on French corpses. When the fighting finally ended in the early afternoon, the English could scarcely believe they had survived, let alone won. The field was theirs, but at what cost? English casualties were miraculously light, perhaps 25 dead, including the Duke of York, who may have suffocated in his armor after falling in the mud. Among the common soldiers, losses were even lighter, with most injuries coming from exhaustion and disease rather than French weapons. The French losses were catastrophic. Conservative estimates put their dead at 10,000, with some chronicles claiming numbers twice that high. 3 dukes lay dead in the mud. Alençon, Brabant, 7 counts had fallen, along with over 1,500 knights, virtually the entire military leadership of northern France. The cream of French chivalry had been destroyed in a single afternoon. The political implications were staggering. The French monarchy, already weakened by Charles VI's madness and internal feuding, had lost an entire generation of military commanders. The great noble families that had dominated French politics for centuries were devastated. Some bloodlines were entirely extinguished, their lands left without heirs. For England, Agincourt was more than a military victory, it was a validation of Henry V's reign and his claim to the French throne. The impossible had been achieved through a combination of tactical innovation, desperate courage, and sheer luck. The longbow had proven superior to heavy cavalry. English discipline had triumphed over French numbers, and a young king had established himself as one of the great military commanders in history. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, Henry faced the delicate task of managing victory. Hundreds of French nobles had been captured, representing potential ransoms worth fortunes. The Duke of Orleans alone was worth more than the entire cost of the campaign. But Henry also understood that these prisoners were political assets as well as financial ones. He ordered that the most important captives be treated with the honor due their rank. Despite the brutality of the battle itself, they would be taken to England, where they would serve as both symbols of English victory and bargaining chips in future negotiations. Some, like Orleans, would remain in captivity for decades, becoming almost English themselves through long association with their captors. The treatment of prisoners also revealed the social dynamics of medieval warfare. Common soldiers who had fought just as bravely as their noble commanders were simply killed, while aristocrats were preserved for ransom. This wasn't mere cruelty, it reflected the economic and political realities of the age, where a single noble's ransom could fund armies and buy alliance. Despite their stunning victory, the English were still deep in enemy territory with winter approaching, and their numbers still perilously small. Henry ordered the army to resume its march to Calais. But now they moved as conquerors rather than desperate fugitives. French resistance along the route melted away. Who would dare face the men who had achieved the impossible at Agincourt? The march took on an almost surreal quality. English soldiers, many still suffering from dysentery and exhaustion, found themselves hailed as heroes in their own minds while struggling simply to put one foot in front of the other. They carried with them the banners and armor of dead French nobles, proof of their incredible victory, but also the weight of what they had witnessed and done. When they finally reached Calais on November 16, 1415, they were greeted as heroes by the English garrison, but the celebration was tempered by the reality of medieval campaigning. Many men who had survived the battle would die of disease in the following weeks, victims of illnesses contracted during the long, difficult march. Henry V landed in Dover on November 16, 1415, to scenes of jubilation that England had rarely witnessed. Church bells rang throughout the realm, and bonfires blazed on every hilltop. The impossible victory had transformed the young king from a questionable claimant to the throne into a national hero rivaling Edward III and the Black Prince. The victory parade through London was one of the most spectacular in English history. Henry, ever conscious of the religious implications of his victory, attributed his success entirely to divine providence. He refused to allow his damaged helmet to be displayed, insisting that glory belonged to God alone. This public humility only enhanced his reputation among both nobles and commoners. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Henry's return was how Agincourt had united England behind his reign. The great noble families that had viewed his father's usurpation with suspicion now saw in Henry a king capable of winning back England's lost territories in France. Common soldiers who had fought at Agincourt became living legends in their villages, their stories growing with each telling. Agincourt's impact extended far beyond the muddy field where it was fought. The battle fundamentally altered the strategic balance between England and France, creating opportunities that Henry V would exploit ruthlessly in the years to come. With French military leadership devastated and the monarchy weakened, England was positioned to make unprecedented gains in France. The immediate political aftermath saw the Burgundians, led by Duke John the Fearless, move closer to alliance with England. The devastating losses suffered by the Armagnac faction at Agincourt had upset the delicate balance between the two French factions, and Burgundy saw opportunity in English success. This would lead to the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which recognized Henry V as heir to the French throne. The battle also demonstrated the changing nature of medieval warfare. The age of heavy cavalry dominance was ending, replaced by professional infantry, innovative tactics, and new technology. The French would eventually learn these lessons, but not before suffering further defeats that would culminate in English control of much of France. Even as Henry V continued his French campaigns, Agincourt was already passing from history into legend. The battle's dramatic elements, overwhelming odds, desperate courage, stunning victory, made it perfect material for chroniclers and storytellers. Within decades, accounts of the battle were being embellished with fictional details that would become as famous as the historical fact. The most influential chronicler was John Harding, whose account emphasized the role of divine intervention in the English victory. He portrayed Henry as a Christian king whose faith and righteousness were rewarded by God with miraculous success. This religious interpretation would profoundly influence later understanding of the battle, particularly in Protestant England. French chroniclers, naturally, took a different approach. They emphasized the muddy conditions, the tactical advantages of the English position, and the mistakes made by French commanders. Some French accounts minimized English numbers while inflating their own casualties, creating a narrative of honorable defeat against impossible odds rather than humiliating military failure. But it would be William Shakespeare, writing nearly 2 centuries later, who would immortalize Agincourt in the English-speaking imagination. His play Henry V, with its stirring St. Crispin's Day speech, transformed the battle from a medieval military engagement into a timeless story of courage, leadership, and national identity. Shakespeare's Henry V became the archetypal warrior king, and his version of Agincourt the ultimate underdog victory. From a purely military perspective, Agincourt represented a revolution in tactical thinking that would influence warfare for centuries. Henry V's use of defensive positioning, combined arms tactics, and the strategic deployment of archers created a template for defeating superior numbers through superior planning and execution. The English longbow had been used effectively before, most notably at Crécy and Poitiers, but never with such devastating results against such overwhelming odds. The combination of massed archery with disciplined infantry proved that mobility and firepower could triumph over heavy armor and numerical superiority. This lesson would be relearned countless times throughout history, from Cannae to Waterloo to the Normandy landing. Perhaps more importantly, Agincourt demonstrated the importance of adaptability in military leadership. Henry V abandoned traditional medieval tactics because they were unsuited to his circumstances. Instead, he used the terrain, weather, and enemy overconfidence to create victory from near certain defeat. This flexible approach to warfare would become increasingly important as military technology continued to evolve. The battle also highlighted the growing importance of professional soldiers over noble amateurs. The English men-at-arms and archers were veterans of multiple campaigns, trained to fight as units rather than individual heroes. The French, for all their courage and martial skill, fought as individual knights rather than as a coordinated army. This difference in military culture proved decisive. While the strategic and tactical lessons of Agincourt are important, we must not forget the human cost of the battle. Behind the statistics of dead and wounded were thousands of individual tragedies. Fathers who would never return home, sons who died before their prime, families destroyed by a single day's fighting. The French nobility in particular paid a terrible price for their overconfidence. Entire bloodlines were extinguished, great estates left without heirs, and the political structure of northern France shattered. The effects would be felt for generations as widows struggled to maintain their lands and children grew up fatherless. Even among the English victors, the cost was significant. Many men who survived the battle would die of disease in the following months, victims of the campaign's harsh conditions. Others would carry physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Medieval medicine offered little help for the wounds of war, and many veterans would live with pain and disability as permanent reminders of their service. The common soldiers on both sides deserve particular remembrance. They had no say in the political disputes that led to war, no hope of profit from victory, and little chance of survival if defeated. Yet they fought with courage and determination, following their leaders into battle against overwhelming odds. Their stories are largely lost to history, but their sacrifice made possible the great events that we remember today. Agincourt cannot be understood in isolation from the broader social and political context of early 15th century Europe. The battle occurred during a period of unprecedented crisis. The Great Mortality, Black Death, had killed perhaps 1/3 of Europe's population. The Great Western Schism had divided Christianity, and traditional social structures were under enormous strain. The 100 Years' War itself was as much about internal politics as international conflict. Both England and France were dealing with disputed successions, rebellious nobles, and the challenge of governing kingdoms where central authority was weak. War provided an opportunity for kings to unite their subjects behind a common cause and for nobles to win glory and profit through conquest. The devastation of Agincourt must also be seen in the context of medieval demographics. The French nobility that died in the mud represented not just military leaders, but the social and economic elite of northern France. Their deaths created a power vacuum that would take generations to fill, contributing to the political instability that plagued France throughout the 50s. For England, Agincourt provided temporary unity and national purpose, but at enormous cost. The campaign consumed vast resources and led to decades of French warfare that would ultimately bankrupt the English crown. The victory was glorious, but its long-term consequences were far more complex than contemporary celebrations suggested. As we stand here today, more than 6 centuries after that misty morning near a small French village, the echoes of Agincourt still reverberate through history. What happened on October 25, 1415 was more than just a battle. It was a moment when the impossible became possible, when courage and cunning triumphed over overwhelming odds, and when the course of history pivoted on the actions of a few thousand desperate men. The tactical innovations pioneered at Agincourt would influence military thinking for centuries. The importance of combined arms, the value of defensive positioning, and the power of disciplined troops over superior numbers became fundamental principles of warfare. Military academies still study Henry V's campaign as an example of strategic audacity and tactical flexibility. But Agincourt's cultural impact may be even more significant than its military lesson. The battle became a touchstone for English national identity, a symbol of what could be achieved through courage, determination, and divine providence. Shakespeare's immortal words, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers," transformed a medieval military engagement into a timeless meditation on leadership, sacrifice, and human potential. The story of Agincourt reminds us that history is not inevitable, that single moments can change the trajectory of civilizations, and that human courage can overcome seemingly impossible odds. In our own age of rapid change and global challenges, these lessons remain remarkably relevant. We see echoes of Agincourt's themes throughout history. At Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans held back the Persian Empire; at the Alamo, where a handful of defenders made their final stand on D-Day, when Allied forces faced overwhelming German defense. Each time, ordinary people faced extraordinary circumstances and chose to fight rather than surrender. The men who fought at Agincourt, both English and French, were products of their time, fighting for causes and beliefs we might not fully understand today. But their courage, their determination, and their willingness to face the impossible speaks across the centuries to something universal in human nature. Henry V himself lived only 7 more years after Agincourt, dying at the height of his power and success. His infant son would inherit both the English throne and his claim to France, but the long war would ultimately end in English defeat and withdrawal. The territories won through Henry's brilliant campaigns would be lost to French resurgence and Joan of Arc's inspiration. Yet Agincourt endures in the villages of northern France, where tourists still visit the battlefield and local guides tell stories passed down through generations. It endures in English culture, where Henry V remains an archetypal hero. It endures in military colleges, where young officers study the tactical lessons of that muddy field. And it endures in the human imagination, where the story of 3,000 men defeating 60,000 continues to inspire and amaze. Perhaps most importantly, Agincourt reminds us that history is made by individuals, by the king who chose to fight rather than surrender, by the archers who drew their bows despite impossible odds, by the knights who charged into certain death for honor and country. These were not superhuman figures but ordinary people who found extraordinary courage when history called upon them. In our modern world of global conflicts and complex challenges, the story of Agincourt offers both inspiration and warning. It shows us what human courage can achieve, but it also reminds us of the terrible cost of war and the fragility of human life. The mud of Agincourt claimed princes and peasants alike, and their sacrifice should never be forgotten or glorified without understanding its true weight. And that brings us to the end of another incredible journey through history, my friends. The story of Agincourt, of those 3,000 English warriors who faced impossible odds and somehow miraculously prevailed, is one that never fails to give me chills. It's a reminder that history isn't just dates and names in textbooks. It's the story of real people who faced real challenges and somehow found the courage to do the impossible. If this epic tale of courage, strategy, and against all odds victory has inspired you, I'd love for you to hit that like button. It really helps this channel reach more history lovers like yourself. And if you're hungry for more incredible stories from the past, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell. We've got some absolutely mind-blowing historical episodes coming up that I guarantee will leave you on the edge of your seat. Speaking of which, what would you like to see next? Are you fascinated by ancient battles like Thermopylae or Cannae, medieval sieges that lasted for years?
The great naval battles that changed the course of empires? Drop a comment below and let me know what period or battle has captured your imagination. Your suggestions often become our next deep dive episode. And here's something special if you want to dive even deeper into the world of medieval warfare and the 100 Years' War. I've put together some incredible resources in the description below. You'll find links to the best historical sources about Agincourt, recommended books that bring this period to life, and even some virtual museum tours where you can see actual artifacts from the battle. Don't forget to share this video with that friend who's always talking about medieval history, or anyone who loves stories of the underdog triumphing against impossible odds. History is meant to be shared, discussed, and debated, and every share helps build our community of passionate history enthusiasts. Before you go, I want to thank each and every one of you who makes this channel possible. Your likes, comments, shares, and subscriptions allow us to keep exploring these incredible stories and bringing the past to life with the detail and drama they deserve. You're not just viewers, you're fellow time travelers. And together we're keeping these epic moments of human history alive for future generations. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and remember, history is all around us, waiting to inspire us with stories of courage, ingenuity, and the indomitable human spirit. This has been Epic Histories, and I'll see you in the next adventure through time. Remember to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell because the past has so many more incredible stories to tell and you won't want to miss a single one.